All right, looks like we're live. Hi, I'm Ryan Macklin. This is Master Plan episode 66, where I am going to talk with the esteemed creator of role playing games that we love, Robin Laws, about setting design in RPGs. And so here we have Robin Laws. So, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Robin Laws!
Hey, how you doing, everybody, out there in Twitter and internet land and Google
So,
land, I
in
guess,
Google
whatever
Land,
land you're
whatever
dialing in
land you're
from.
from. We love
We
you no
welcome
matter.
you.
Yes, and later podcast land. You know.
Yes.
So hey, again, this will also be put on the audio channel later, which most people probably will be listening to. So they already know it's on the audio channel because I just told them. Um, Robin, we're going to talk about the setting, just the art of setting design, and you've made a lot of settings over the years of your own. You've also developed a lot of other IPs into role-playing game settings. Can you give us a quick sort of a list of your favorites and the things that you're really proud of as far as the settings that you've created and forged?
Well, the settings I've created would be the Feng Shui slash Shadow Fist setting, which is very much on my mind because that's Feng Shui 2 is now out of my hands and into production at Atlas and with Hal Mangold at Atomic Overmind and is shaping up beautifully. So that's an example of taking a setting that I'd established previously and then looking at ways to change or massage it or dust up the corners for a new iteration of the game. The one I think you wanted to focus on in particular is Ashen Stars, which is the space opera setting for Gumshoe. Other Gumshoe settings I've done have included the Mutant City Blues, which is a super-powered police procedural set in the very near future, and the Esotericist, which is a modern agents against a particularly very specific occult conspiracy. I've also, as you suggested, worked on adapting other settings into role-playing, particularly the works of Jack Vance in the Dying Earth role-playing game, and just very recently in the Gaian Reach role-playing game. And I've also done a certain amount of work on other people's settings. For example, Greg Stafford's seminal setting of Glorantha, which also worked on a mobile game called King of Dragon Pass, which we're now revisiting finally after the app revolution has turned a before its time cool little game into a hit. We're doing a follow-up on that called Six H's. So over the years, I've had opportunities to look at setting from those three different points of view, and also from the point of view of a novelist and a writer of fiction. So I've written a certain amount of fiction in the Pathfinder world of Golarion. I did a trilogy of Warhammer fantasy novels. I did a novelization or a novel set in the City of Heroes world. So I've come at the issue of setting and games from a whole bunch of different angles over the years.
Cool. So, yeah, I definitely want to talk to you. There's a bunch of things that I want to talk to you about in detail, but um, uh, I want to hit onto the. So you've got Feng Shui, which how old is that at that point? I mean, this is like in the height of Hong Kong cinema is when it first came out, right?
Yeah, it depends on when you want to date it from. It actually was first published in '96,
Hmm.
but the work on the game began in '94. Originally, it was supposed to be a role-playing game, and then the setting was then imported into a card game. The card game wound up coming out before the role-playing game did. But yes, exactly, that was set in at the very time of the heyday of Hong Kong action cinema. It was obviously right before the 1997 handover. For example, one of the issues we had to deal with in the update was, well, we're long past 1996. In the original book, it tells you the date is always 1996.
Right.
And in that instance, we were just sort of covering ourselves because we didn't know what was going to happen with the handover. I kind of thought that what did happen was what was going to happen, if that makes any sense, which I guess it shouldn't, since Feng Shui has a time travel element, that basically that it would become an authoritarian democracy with sort of a higher level of freedom than the rest of China had, and that it would go on being Hong Kong, basically, which it has. And who knows about the future, but at the moment that is held true. So in the new version, I set that aside, and I think we can be reasonably confident that in 2016 Hong Kong will still be more or less Hong Kong, or if something horrible happens, then in retrospect we can say, oh well, it's always 2015. But so one of the things about that was just simply updating it and taking into account all of the extraordinary changes that the real Hong Kong has undergone in that decade and a half.
Cool. So using the Wayback Machine to go back to like 94, 95, when you're doing the development on Feng Shui, what do you remember? What was sort of the kicker for this being a setting beyond going from, hey, Hong Kong action, to sort of figuring out what some of the specifics are, figuring out what sort of initial bits of setting you end up making for it?
Well, it came out of the fact that Hong Kong action encompasses more than one genre. Mm-hmm. So I was looking for a way to connect all of those things up into one game. And so that's where the idea that there are different time junctures that you can travel between through a sort of intermediary zone called the Netherworld sprang up. And so that allows you to have a sword-wielding wuxia warrior fighting alongside a Chow Yun-Fat style two guns blazing killer. And so all of the settings sort of came from that idea, and then the next thing you have to build on from that, you would extrapolate, well, why are all of these things connected, and why would a wuxia warrior interact with a killer? Well, there must be a war across these time boundaries trying to control the world. And then that took into account the idea of Feng Shui as it's presented in Chinese cinema in particular, where your possession of certain areas with strong qi power, or even where your ancestors are buried and how auspiciously and in what pattern they're buried, affects your fate. And so that gave the last thing that was needed, the core activity of the game, because every setting and every role-playing game has to have a really strong core activity to be successful. So in Dungeons and Dragons, for example, the core activity is go into dungeons and fight dragons, where dragons can also be any other number of creatures that you kill and take their treasure. Or in Vampire, the core activity is engage in internecine vampire politics. Or, and you can go down the list, and every classic game that is also paired with a setting has a really strong core activity. So the core activity in Feng Shui becomes engage in this war across time junctures for the control of Feng Shui sites. Mm-hmm. And well, what happens if you control a Feng Shui site? There must then be powerful organizations in the different time zones that do control the course of time. And so that's where the various factions come from. The Ascended is sort of the object model in the modern world of what happens if you have a monopoly on the best Feng Shui. And the Eaters of the Lotus in the original version were the equivalent in the ancient world. Now, in the new version, I've sort of mixed that up a bit, and they're kind of been rocked on their heels because their old juncture closed up. They've moved to the Tang Dynasty. They're no longer quite in charge, but they really want to be. And so that gives you the sort of classic evil eunuchs against the empire sort of storyline.
So it sounds like, sort of, because that sounds like a huge amount of the history of making Feng Shui into a few sentences. An early decision there would have been like, okay, well, I want everything together. How about this thing of the Netherworld? Like, what would be like sort of? You remember what like your earliest decisions were in that, whether they were ones you kept or not?
The earliest decision was we want to have all the different action genres interact. Mm-hmm. So let's isolate what those genres are. Mm-hmm. And in that case, it was the wuxia style martial arts, the somewhat more realistic 19th century martial arts as typified by the Once Upon a Time in China series, the modern day guns blazing action is typified by The Killer and other John Woo flicks, or the broader genre of uh, heroic bloodshed. And then I wanted to add a futuristic genre, even though Hong Kong cinema didn't really have very much of one, in order to add a new element that was distinct to this setting,
Okay.
rather than just being a mashup of everybody else's stuff. I did want to make sure that on top of all of this, there were elements that were specific to Feng Shui, because although this was the first game to acknowledge Hong Kong cinema and how cool it was, because I had a bit of a head start on that as far as fandom was concerned, that I did want to make sure that there were things that were specific to this setting, rather than just being a generalized adaptation of the idea of Hong Kong cinema.
So moving forward in time quite a bit, let's talk about the esotericist a bit, because that's the first Gumshoe game, which is and with all of the Gumshoe games, it's not just a general thing. You've got a setting paired with that particular build of Gumshoe.
That's
right. Yeah. Okay.
So Gumshoe begins not as a setting idea, but as a mechanical idea. So Simon Rogers contacted me and said, can you design a better investigative game, specifically one that deals with the problem of failing your crucial role that you need to gather a clue and move forward into the storyline. Now, once you solve that problem, it creates a whole bunch of other opportunities. So Gumshoe is not just a game that solves that problem, but a game that extrapolates upon the benefits of having solved that problem. Specifically, if you can be sure that if the character has the right ability and looks in the right place and does the right thing, they get the information. That means you can give them way more information, and it becomes more about taking a whole bunch of information and assembling it into a picture of what happened and what you're trying to work out.
Right.
And so that becomes more like the way, an actual, say, murder investigation happens in the real world.
Right.
It's not about finding the one clue that leads to the second clue that leads to the third clue that solves the case. It's about amassing a crap ton of data and trying to figure out which of it matters.
So then, why the esotericist? Given that and given your solution, what sparked that?
In the realm of role-playing, the thing that we most associate with the mystery genre is supernatural horror. And that's because the big kahuna of investigative role-playing has always been Call of Cthulhu. So I wanted to come up with a occult supernatural game in which you were competent investigators, because that was the whole point of demonstrating what the rule system could do. So that basic idea, you are trained investigators up against the occult, then became the core activity of the game. And so the next question is, well, how do you make this different than every other horror investigative game? Why is it this instead of Chill or indeed Call of Cthulhu? And of course later we got the license and did Trail of Cthulhu, which did a lot more to turn people's heads onto what Gumshoe was doing, because it was taking something familiar and then here's this one difference and here's the changes that come out from that. So I then thought about how I feel about horror. Mm-hmm. And the thing that really horrifies me in my daily life are not mummies or vampires, but the ambient emotional noise of our modern world, particularly the way that our media generates anxiety, and whether it's just reporting all the horrible things that go on in the world, or whether it's purposely generating our anxiety in order to sell us advertising. And so the idea then became, well, what if there's a conspiracy that makes supernatural use of this sort of emotional cognitive dissonance that we all live in the modern world and are being constantly bombarded with? Every time you open up Twitter, it's full of anger and anxiety and some sort of new atrocity somewhere in the world. And so what if there are supernatural conspirators trying to use this sense of cognitive dissonance as the fuel for ritual workings to bring in the monsters that you wind up fighting? And so that then extrapolated into both the esoterists, the conspirators that are trying to do that, and the Ordo Veritatis, the sort of mirror conspiracy organization that you work for that's trying to stop them.
So it sounds like so if I get this right, Feng Shui sounds like it's effectively setting before system, or setting, like that's the big deal, and then also we will make the system work with the setting. And esoterics was we have the system idea, and so it's system then setting. We're going to make the setting work with it, and then those sort of feed back forth into each other. But would those be the two different starting points? Would I be getting that right?
I guess more or less, insofar as Feng Shui took an existing rule set, a sort of almost kind of GURPSy, multi-genre, crunchy rule set that Jose Garcia, the founder of Daedalus, the original publisher of Feng Shui, designed for a game called Nexus: The Infinite City, and it stripped out almost all of the crunchiness, and even more of the crunchiness has been stripped out in the new version, in order to have something that felt as fast and furious as the John Woo action scene. So there was certainly a mechanical imperative that arose from the genre and setting, whereas the esoterics in particular is an unusual case in that it's sort of what's the setting that will showcase this rule set in this marketplace. But then all the subsequent Gumshoe games, since Gumshoe already exists by that point, are again about taking a new setting and applying its needs to the basic chassis that Gumshoe provides. And one of our watchwords with Gumshoe is that it's not a generic system per se, that you change how things work in order to fit the demands of the setting or genre.
Right.
So, for example, grenades don't work the same in every Gumshoe game because they don't work the same in every fictional genre. They are different in the sort of Clancy-esque realm of the esoterics than they are in the more sort of low-powered supers realm of Mutant City Blues, and different still in Ashen Stars.
Yep. So, so with the sort of like wealth of knowledge you've accumulated in working on making your IP and working on other people's IP, if you're sitting down and you have you feel the need to make a setting for whatever reason, are there any initial steps or questions that you're asking yourself? Like I've got a few notes here that seem like they're directions based on what you've said, but is there anything before I sort of get into that is on your mind?
Well, the first question is, what is the core activity?
Right.
And the second question is, how does this enter the dialogue of how other settings have presented the genre in the past? What's different about this? And in other words, what do you do in the game, and why are we bothering to do this at all?
Okay.
And then onto that, then begins your level of extrapolation. But you always have, whenever you extrapolate a new detail of the setting, you then have to go back to ask yourself whether that actually solves the problem that you set out to solve by deciding to have this game in this setting.
Okay. Do you have an example of one of those sort of like details that in like either Feng Shui or one of the Gumshoe games that you came up with that ended up not solving a problem?
For example, in Ashen Stars, the space combat system was originally sort of queuing off an idea of Simon's that you would that what station you had on the ship would be very important, and that you would all sort of be contributing to each other and moving points back and forth around the ship. But when we played that, it seemed to be just sort of way too complicated, which was disqualifying in and of itself, and not as much in the spirit of the Gumshoe rules in general, which are emulative, that this was more sort of a crunchy simulation of something that you don't really see in any particular space opera. So the second version of Space Combat dialed that way back into something that was more sort of abstract and description based than, and therefore fit the rest of the system.
Yeah. So, so one of the settings there that sort of particularly interests me because it's a hard nut to crack is Ashen Stars. Like whenever we do anything with a modern day, urban occult thing, we have all of Earth to draw from, as Ken is fond of saying. Whenever we do anything fantasy, we have all of the fantasy tropes that are public domain to draw from or to rebel against. But we all can we can use the word elves, freely. But we don't have that when it comes to doing anything that where we want to riff on Star Wars or Star Trek or any of the other big sci-fi properties. So when you made Ashen Stars, which I think you've pitched or others have pitched in the past, is basically the Star Trek gumshoe game, more or less.
I have no legal knowledge of any property called Star Trek or its
Certainly
heavily
other
funded legal department.
Right.
So it's not just Star Trek, but
Right.
It does set out to solve the problems of space opera gaming. And I think for a lot of people, Star Trek is more of a template for procedural episodic play,
Right.
because it's based on a TV series, which adapts more readily. Lots of people have played Star Wars over the years, and it kind of works as its own thing. But one of the ideas was to try and solve the things that make Star Trek or Battlestar Galactica or Firefly-like play difficult, although Firefly actually, interestingly, solves a lot of those problems too, in that all of those things have sort of a quasi-military structure to them with a command structure. And so one of the things that is difficult to do in role-playing is you don't want either one of the players being able to give orders to all the other characters, or a non-player character run by the GM giving orders to the players. So the idea was to find a way to take sort of the loose coalition of semi-skeezy characters that you normally get in a role-playing game, and then put them on a starship in space.
Sorry, you cut out there for a moment. Could you repeat that?
So the idea is to take the usual sort of skeevy group of characters who occupy a role-playing game, who are sort of a little bit ethically shady, and they're always in conflict with one another, and to put them on a spaceship and have them solve problems. So that then became a big part of both the setting and one of the central new mechanics that help define what the game is, which is something that we want to have in every gumshoe game, as a new thing that's specific to that iteration. So the idea here is that you are lasers, you are members of a small crew of troubleshooters in this region of the Galactic Empire that used to be patrolled by the Combine, the big intergalactic political entity, but they've had to retreat in the aftermath of a costly war that they won, but at great price. And so in the outer rim, called the Bleed, they just rely on independent contractors to do the things that their patrol ships would have done in the past. Mm-hmm. One of the players in my group at the time, or actually before I designed Ashen Stars, named Alex Johnson, was the one who pointed out to me that, hey, Star Trek is a police procedural show. It's in almost every episode they encounter a mystery. In Next Generation in particular, they then have a boardroom meeting about it. And then they go off and they solve the problem. And then partway through, they figure out what's going on, and what's going on then leads to an ethical dilemma that they then have to deal with. And so that structure is one that certainly appears in Ashen Stars and fits the sort of Star Wars model, or sorry, the Star Trek model better than the Star Wars model. One of the things I also wanted to instill in the setting was the idea that have people consciously realize that they're emulating a space opera TV show, and there's sort of the suggestion that this is the gritty reboot of a 70s show that was a little more innocent in its time, and now a new one has come back. So that's definitely a nod to Battlestar Galactica there. Now, it's not something, it's just as in Feng Shui, you're never encouraged to break the fourth wall and have the characters aware that they're characters in a TV show. I think that's deadly. But the players, when they're trying to get their heads around what they should be doing and how they should be making decisions and what things are likely to work in this world, that's something they can draw on when they're trying to visualize stuff. So, for example, Chris Huth is a player in my game and also one of the illustrators of Ashen Stars, really enjoyed drawing the sort of rubber mask version of his Kick Thick character. The Kick Thick are the sort of locust men, who there's a big one on the cover of the book, who, obviously in the new version they would be CGI, but in the 70s version they would have been guys in masks. And I think he enjoyed drawing the guy in rubber mask version even more than the official version that appears in the game.
So that brings up to, I think, the core point, or the core thing when it comes to a sci-fi game is, what do you do to communicate effectively all of the cultural tropes that you want to communicate but can't for legal reasons? Like, there are so often where you want to, like, guys, this is just like a Vulcan except for this one thing, but you can't say that in the same way you could say, guys, this is an elf except for this one thing. So
Well, the
what do you
solution
do?
is I didn't actually quite do that because if you really want Vulcans or Chewbacca's in your game, Wookiees
Right.
in your game, you can just do that, right?
Sure.
I don't need to do that for you. So instead, for the different alien races, what I tried to do was to start with sort of an emotional impulse or an archetype that players like to play that has sort of a structural kernel in it, but isn't just an actionable property of Paramount Pictures or
Right.
Lucasfilm with the serial numbers filed off. So, for example, in Star Trek, there's a race who are initially antagonistic, but then sort of turn into sort of quasi good guys, and that's the Klingons. In Ashen Stars, there's a group called the Darug, but they are otherwise nothing like the Klingons. They're sort of more like sneaky, sniveling dwarf types. And there is an alien race, the Bala, for people who always want to play elves. And there's a kick-ass race for people who always want to play warrior kick-ass types. So it kind of takes these archetypal things that people like to play again and again in their games, regardless of genre, and builds on those rather than just saying, well, how do I make this as much like a Vulcan as I can without getting sued?
Sure.
So there's no Vulcans per se, or Klingons per se, or Chewbacca's per se.
Right. Is there anything within Ashen Stars that you wish that you could have used a cultural touchstone to avoid over-explaining or anything like that?
No, I don't really, because again, the great thing about role-playing is that your GMs and players will commit your intellectual property offenses for you. And, you don't have to do that.
Okay.
So you want to sort of drill down a level, and that sort of homage, I think, is just, kind of cheating from the point of view of if you're professionally writing a setting, that people who really love those tropes are going to be able to import them on by themselves.
Okay. So then one of the other things that I find utterly fascinating about particularly about Mutant City Blues is the amount of detail that you put into the Quaid diagram, the setting design that is how to make a mutant procedural work. And this is actually the last time I had you on the show was when we talked about Mutant City Blues and we talked about the Quaid diagram. But for people who have no idea what we're talking about, could you briefly tell us about Mutant City Blues and this diagram I keep talking about?
This is the diagram that I'm proudest of all the diagrams I've put in any game ever in my career, because it functions both as a rules element and as a key setting element. So the idea in Mutant City Blues is that there's an SMH, a sudden mutation event, no, SME, a sudden mutation event, where a small but statistically significant percentage of the world's population gets mutant powers. And so unlike, say, the Marvel or DC universe, where powers come from magic and mutations and radioactive spiders and gamma rays, or whatever, that being robots and stuff, there's every possible explanation for how people get their superpowers in the standard comic book universes, but that doesn't work in a procedural game where you're trying to solve mysteries involving superpowers, because if, for example, someone is killed in a locked room in the Marvel universe, the answer is, boop, could be anybody.
Right.
could be Dormammu, could be Galactus, could be Kitty Pryde. It seems unlikely. She seems like a nice girl, but so there's no way of answering that question in a mystery game in a conventional comic book universe. So in the Mutant City Blues universe, all the superpowers come from the same place and are scientifically explicable and already have a certain amount of forensic lore surrounding them. And in particular, Dr. Lucius Quaid has already identified where on the mutated genetic sequence all of the superpowers occur, so that if you have, for example, a lightning bolt, you also are much more likely to have a certain set of superpowers that are near it on the genome, but you're not going to have web slinging and venom and all these sort of insecty powers which are elsewhere. And so the Quaid diagram shows you the connections between all of these things. And when you're creating your superpowered character, you start on any point on the Quaid diagram, and how many powers you can take and what they cost you depends on your being able to follow a line on the Quaid diagram. And sometimes when you jump between powers, you also inherit a defect, like being prone to mania, or or to eventual ossification of your bones, or whatever it is. So that this is both a game artifact, it's what you use in character creation, and it's a world artifact that your cops, when you go to a scene, you have a little laminated version of the Quaid diagram with you. And if you see both traces of webbing and the scorch of a lightning bolt at the crime scene, you know you've got at least 2 perps, because no one person has those 2 powers.
Right, and it seems like if you know somebody, I'm looking at the Quaid diagram now, and if you know somebody who seems to have both microvision and thermal vision, then you also know that they are susceptible to voyeurism. Because
Exactly.
that is a trait that crosses right through.
Right, and obviously fits in a lot of possible police crime scenarios.
Right. So, which I mean, given that they're cops, it's also certainly a thing of like, well, yeah, that one guy is creepy. He's really good at forensics, but he's really, really creepy as a player character kind of vibe, or as a friendly NPC sort of thing. So yeah, so that ends up being a really fascinating bit, which I recommend people, and I'll have that linked to in the show notes, in particular, because it's just a one-page PDF that kind of just I think. It's one of those pictures 1,000 words sort of things. It's like one-page PDF, really just details a lot of information about a setting. So
I'm sure that the more sophisticated cops now have it on their iPads, where these sort of cringy old school guys still have their sort of rumpled version with coffee stains on it that they unfold each time.
Yeah, just eventually that'll just be like on eBay as like, one of the classic first editions where, before they discovered all these other things, and it's an artifact, and it's yeah. Okay, so before I take questions from listeners and questions that people submitted, incidentally, apparently the Q&A app is not working for me today, so people want to ask Robin questions through me as your mouthpiece. Just use Twitter and just at Ryan Macklin, and I will I will ask awesome questions. I won't answer any of them. That's not my job here. To shift gears a bit and to talk about like the micro settings that you have with the drama system, with Hillfolk and all of the various other things on there. When it comes to making something like that, that's almost more, at least for like the ones that you had folks, including me, do for that and for Blood on the Snow, what are the things to consider in that really consolidated space? What's sort of the first thing? Sort of walk me through a process I should be using.
So what we're talking about is the series pitches for Drama System. Drama System is a game of personal interaction between the player characters, and you mostly kind of create the setting as you go as the players and GM. So the thing to get setting designers to do was to just focus on that format, which, as you recall, has a series of headings. And one of the very first thing it asks you to do is a quick nutshell of what it is, which is basically the core activity for that group. Now, the sort of uber core activity for any drama system game is you're just people who want and need things from each other, and they're emotionally entangled, but also the characters are doing something, just as in a cable series. Walter White is involved in a meth empire, or Masters and Johnson and Masters of Sex are engaged in sex research. So you would just list that as your one-line premise. And then after that, it's basically a bullet-pointed list of all of the character types that you could conceivably play, which the players then, look at the list and decide which one, or they make up something else that's sort of like that. And one of the big challenges with setting creators for that one was to get them to drop the habit of explaining everything about the setting first and only then getting to the characters. So a huge number of people instead wrote the setting chunk, moved it up ahead of the characters, and I almost invariably moved it back, because this is not about players playing in your setting. This is about players making up their own setting, starting with who they are, and then everything else builds out from that. And then the format then is very specific, very bullet pointy. So there's, for example, there's a tightening the screws section that lists all sorts of different plot developments that the GM or even another player can introduce in order to increase the tension on the characters and throw their emotional relationships out of skew again if they seem to be getting too harmonious. So it's just really a matter of following that very simple, very bullet pointy format that is more a series of suggestions of things that you could possibly do in your game, rather than a conventional, here's the setting and here's how it works.
Right. One of the things in looking over that, since I'm doing the drama system stretch goal for the Dracula dossier, is how that approach, just looking at that, is a pretty handy way of just thinking about making settings in the first place, and then later, if you really want to, write an encyclopedia. But starting with those core essentials.
Yeah, it really is about boiling it down, and it's about sort of, if you think about your great dramatic TV shows that you love, rather than your procedural ones in particular, that they really do focus on the characters, and if, to the extent that they bring in a world, they bring in the world sort of bit by bit. There's not a big chunk of exposition at the beginning. So you learn a lot about Westeros through the course of watching Game of Thrones, but occasionally there's a chunk where someone just explains a ton about Westeros, but usually you learn it through the way that people behave. Right. And they only bring in as much as you can absorb, because it's a TV series. It's not, the original novels. You have a certain amount of space to deliver exposition, but even there, delivering world information is deadly boring unless you have some sort of emotional stake in it, either because you have a question about the world that you want to see answered, or because it inflects the way that the people you care about relate to each other.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there was one of the first big game that I worked on, the Dresden Files, just the whole transferring from, this is how everything in a novel is explained, and in nice piecemeal ways that have context, to this is how game books work, in that they are references in addition to into instruction manuals and everything. It was certainly made it a very non-trivial problem, given how many books were in that series, or are in that series as it's ongoing.
Right, because you then have to go through them and parse out the little nuggets and present them in a more coherent form, and then at the end of the cycle, when it actually hits play again, they'll be re-nuggetified, which is a word, I promise you, into little bits and pieces as the players ask questions. And one of the things that you have an advantage of as a GM, as opposed to a writer of fiction or television or movies, is that by definition, if the players are answering a question, they are also the audience, and those are the questions they care about. And so you can provide a lot more information in a scene than you would in an equivalent scene in another medium, because by definition you know that they care because they're asking.
Right. And it's sort of interesting to look at the game book, especially in those like IP translation things, as that thing that just sort of sits in between this character in a book asked a question, and now I need to remember what that answer is because this character in a game is going to ask a question.
Right. And that's why, very detailed settings that you want to honor and supply the canonical version of can be very challenging in role-playing, just because there's so much information, and as much as the creator encourages you to make it your own, a lot of people are really reluctant to do that. People don't want to, as much as Greg Stafford tells them to make Lorentha their own, a lot of people want to be accurately quoting back something from the vast corpus of glorified
Right.
information that has been created over the past 30 years.
Right. I mean, there certainly is a lot of. I mean, people who play in IP games. There's certainly a very big celebration aspect to it, and um, which I mean just ends up making the job of translating that into such a vast thing. But that then gets into like talking about IP games and not about just setting design in general. So let me turn my voice over to other people who have asked questions, and I'm going to start with what may be some easy ones that have just been asked by the illustrious Will Hindmarch. Um, what's a
A ringer,
setting?
you brought in a ringer.
He just brought himself in. It's fantastic. I have some other questions too that have but now I'm just belaboring and not asking a question. What is a setting, games, fiction, etc. that you really admire but you haven't had a chance to work with yet, or that you'd like to work
Um,
with at some point or something?
it would be very cool to do something with Clark Ashton Smith.
Hmm.
I've been very lucky that my very favorite uh, thing has been I've been able to take cracks at both Vance's fantasy and now his science fiction. But Clark Ashton Smith would be cool, and maybe a Philip K. Dick thing might be fun to explore at some point. But I think those would be the main ones.
Yeah. And another one he asks is, are there any approaches to world building that you hope to try out that you've identified but you haven't attempted yet?
Nothing really comes to mind. I've had so many opportunities to do settings over the years that there aren't a lot of sort of abstract ideas that I haven't been able to implement. More likely, there are things that I try not to do, like, for example, try not to have 10,000 years of history that don't impact uh, anything anybody actually does in the game be the big chunk of thing that you confront first. That my interest is always in how does this bit of information relate to the core activity and what people are actually doing in the game. And if it's not there, don't do it. So I don't really tend to think in terms of here's this sort of idea over here that I have waiting on the shelf to plug into this problem over here. Everything always goes the other way. It's what's the problem I'm solving and
Right.
what idea fixes that problem.
Um, yeah, I used to like that whole sense of rich detail at first, but I think I realized that the reason I liked that was because someone else was teaching me the game, and only then afterward, once I was invested, was I actually reading the book. But I found myself not enjoying that when the recent book that I read, that where one of the early things was the timeline of how we're here, well before the what I like. Oh, the awesome stuff is like 10 pages later. Why did you put this here? Um,
Yeah, and
the
if it doesn't reach the player interface, it's wasted space.
right. Um, so we've got Mark Richardson asks, what are elements to avoid in setting design? Proven bad apples, so to speak.
Presciently, I just answered his question already.
Is that the only one?
I think that's the main one. It's just information that doesn't that's not going to reach the players. You want to make sure that you sort of respect the sensitivity of your players, and that there are certain sort of sexist elements of setting design that, for example, a lot of women are going to see as a "No Girls Allowed" sign. You want to avoid those because guess what? Uh, we're going to double the size of our audience by having women play games too, and it's time to pay attention to what people see as a barrier to their entry into the hobby. But other than that, it's really those would be my two main bugaboos: is stuff that is either going to keep people away, that sort of violates their sense of the contract of what they want to engage with, and that's going to be different from group to group, right? If there's a whole group of people who want to play the Gore game, go to it. But in general, if you're writing and trying to draw in a broad audience and appeal to a lot of people, you want to have something that is welcoming to the broadest number of people.
So we've got one here, Bill Templeton on Twitter. So what are the essential elements of a publishable RPG setting? What makes a setting memorable in particular? And I assume that is going to either be a short answer or an answer that will take 2 hours to go through.
Yeah, I think everything I've already said. Plus, I think you want to have some kernels in there of sort of that surprise people or cause cognitive dissonance, or in some way sort of startle or surprise. So it's in role playing. It's sort of a dance between originality and uh, and familiarity, basically. So you want people to be able to enter into it and know what to do and know what tropes they're playing with, but you don't want to just regurgitate everything that has already been. So that's sort of your tension you're working with. And so all of the settings that we've talked about have in different ways introduced familiar elements,
Right.
while at the same time doing things that are surprising or different or sort of come out of left field that don't. And it's this, often the things that don't quite seem to fit that are the ones that are memorable and distinctive.
I think that ends up getting to what I was looking for when I was asking about Ashen Stars, is how you present the familiarity of things um, that we're going to think of when we culturally think of science fiction that you can't say because of legal reasons. That's that that the whole sense of what is what's culturally familiar and playing on that. I
Right.
find
You're
it's
looking for familiar structures and ideas,
right,
things that are not the property of powerful multinationals,
right,
so that's not like, oh, we have a race of hyperlogical guys with pointy ears. Obviously, that's neither original nor something that's going to get past the legal department. But
right,
it's the theme of rationality versus spirituality, for example,
right,
or rationality versus intuition is something that you can build into some element of your world without necessarily uh, invoking, pointy ears and pon farr.
right. The Okay, so then we have Brett Newhall asks, how do you communicate what's unique about a setting as quickly as possible? And I think that gets to our question, or at least that's the inverse of the don't put 1,000 years of history or 10,000 years of history at the beginning of your section. So what would you do to communicate things as quickly as possible?
You make sure that they show up and play right away.
Okay.
So in Ashen Stars, the idea is that you are freelance lawmakers on a fringe of civilization, and you go around in a little ship. Well, that's first session. That's what happens right away.
Hmm.
In Mutant City Blues, the Quaid diagram, you got to make sure that that shows up in one of your very early scenes. So, and that becomes sort of an issue of introductory adventure design, right? Which is usually given short shrift, and something that we try to do with Gumshoe is not just a little sort of piddling, stripped down little intro adventure, which you
Right.
often see in a core book, but a fully fleshed thing that really represents what the game is about, in order that you see what that is, because the adventure is the way that you present the setting to the players. And a first adventure has enormous influence on the way that other people run the game, because they see that as the template for what they're doing. So I think specifically the answer is make sure you have a really great introductory scenario, whether it's in the main book or you bring it out alongside the main book as a separate little publication. But make sure that that revolves really tightly around the main things that you want to highlight in your setting. So if the main things you want to highlight in your setting are, the relationship between these living mummified gods and the people who worship and fear them, don't have your first adventure about leaving the town where those gods are in order to deliver some fish to some other guy who needs fish.
It also sounds like part of that would be solved in making sure some of those elements are, important in character creation. I mean, you mentioned the Quaid diagram, and you use that
Yeah.
in character creation as part of the thing. So you now know that that exists. So is there? So
There is a
that's
challenge there in that character creation needs to be simple. So
right.
you need to balance the simplicity of character generation with the complexity of having to explain a lot of the setting in order to understand what your powers do. So it's sort of a difficult line to walk.
Right. It's a very common line that supers games walk too. Given that you end up getting like, unless it is just like, yeah, you have super strength, make it up, or you are Superman, make it up. Anything that's got more detail than that.
Right, and you've got a huge sort of series of reference points to draw on there.
Right.
Even though you're not necessarily playing the licensed DC game,
Right.
you can use Superman and Wolverine as reference points. And so the more accessible and closer to the norm your setting is, the less of that you'll need, and the less this question will really come up.
Right. Okay. Then, so Jeremy French asks, what are the key topics you have to develop to run a game, and what should you not develop? Now, shifting this specifically to setting design, it seems like you've probably covered that over the course of the interview. Is there any sort of consolidated, here are the key topics?
Well, yeah, again, they just all arise at, what do the players need to know in order for the characters to do what they're going to do?
Okay.
And so always think about how things are reaching the player interface and how they get to interact with those when they're playing them. And so that will be different for every game based on what the core activity is. So for the esoterists, you have to explain a lot about the two organizations that are at war with each other and the demons that the one side is trying to abet and the other side is trying to destroy. So those are the obvious things that you develop in that. And in Ashen Stars, you want to develop the characters' environment, the bleed, and their relationship to it. What's in it? What are they going to encounter when they go out and do things?
So here's another question that touches on some of the stuff we've talked about. So I want to ask it from a stance of like book presentation as opposed to play presentation. How do you balance giving lots of inspirational hooks and creating depth while avoiding writing a boring encyclopedia?
Be an interesting writer is the main thing.
Right.
I think too often we forget to engage people's emotions when they're reading setting material, or we engage sort of a narrow range of emotions. So there's a lot of settings where this guy is the evilest evil who has ever eviled, except this guy is the ruthlessest guy who's ever ruthless, right? And that there's sort of a similarity to it. But that if you think about the poor person sitting there having to read the book and wanting to be engaged as they're reading it and develop the sense of enthusiasm that they're going to communicate to the players, you want to write as engagingly as you possibly can, and add, whether it's adding jokes or writing lyrically or whatever it is. So, for example, people really like the gun descriptions in Feng Shui because they are not just, here's the specs for this gun, here's the specs for that gun. Or when it does get to another gun, it's almost like the gun before it. It says, hey, this gun is like the other gun that was there before it. And so that is full of jokes and is as lively as possible in order not only to prevent the reader from glazing over as they're picking which gun they want, but also to convey a sense of the spirit of that game.
So Will Wilheimer has given me another question to ask you, and it's any advice on writing and improvising clues for Gumshoe games, since those channel the world into the immediacy of play?
The thing to do is to, when you've got a scene that you're creating in Gumshoe, you presumably kind of know when you created the skeleton of the scenes and how they all relate to each other, what the core clues are. Those are the clues that you need in order to move through the story. And then what you do is you just envision the scene, and then you look at the list of investigative abilities and say, well, if I was an anthropologist, what might I notice here? If I was if I had a business acumen, what would I know about this place? If I just had head for trivia, what would I know? And so that you either know a fun fact about the capital of Belize as you're researching it, and then you can say, okay, well, this fun fact about Belize you would get through your history, and this fun fact about Belize you would get through your natural history. Or go the other way, and here's the abilities, what would I find with them? And the interplay between those two things gives them their clues. And if you're improvising, your players are going to help you because they'll say, well, I'm an anthropologist. Do I notice anything about the guys in the trash heap? What culture do they belong to? And then that just all you have to do is either know or make up an answer to that question.
So the last question I'll ask on this topic here is: do you have any books that exemplify good setting design or presentation that you've read over the years that you've liked?
Well, again, I think the one that really comes to mind now is the vast 2-volume Kickstarter guide to Glorantha, which it's a good thing there's a PDF because it's an enormous book. It's almost sort of difficult to handle, but it is really kind of the epitome of everything you could possibly ask for as an introduction to this impossibly rich and detailed and anthropologically and spiritually and historically informed setting. Greg's Great Pendragon campaign, I think, is another really great example of that.
So with that, I of course have one final question for you. So Robin, what is your master plan?
My master plan is to have my act together in 2 weeks. Unfortunately, my master plan is always to have my act together in 2 weeks, so we'll see how that works out.
Well, then I could wish you the best of luck on your continual hopes and successes for your ongoing master plan. Ladies and gentlemen, Robin Laws!
Thanks, guys.